Thanks for joining us. Welcome to March. Today we have a Learning for Leaders session, so we're glad you're able to join us. It's going to be an exciting conversation. We're going to be talking about climate change today and some of the work that's going on in that program action team. So Sandy, if you could bring us the slides. Before we move into that, I do want to have just a couple of logistical and updates to share with you, reminders. The first reminder, next slide, is related to the survey that you should have received earlier this week. This is a survey related to the capacity funding received by each institution and how your institution is able to leverage that. To date, we've received about a 25% response rate. The survey closes on the 15th, so if you could get that information to us, that would be great. No need to calculate it out to 2 or 3 decimals. We just want a quick number back on that, the 2-question survey. And just as a reminder, your institutional information will be anonymous. You do not need to provide that. We just want to be able to provide by region a mean and a range for that so that we can share that. So, and we'll probably do that at the national level, not even at the regional level. So please work on those surveys and get those back. If you can't find the survey, let Sandy know and we can get that back out to you. Thanks in advance for completing that. Also, mark your calendar. September 25th through 27th is the NEDA meeting. This will be the first NEDA meeting in a couple of years that's in person. So we're excited to see everyone and getting ready, and lots of planning going on for that. Number of topics have been submitted. So I think we'll have some really good conversations during that meeting, and it will be nice to be back in person. It is a joint meeting with ESS. And so also excited about that. And then just like this meeting today, be sure to have these First Friday events on your calendar through September. As a reminder, we will not have one in August, but other months we will be holding them. Next month, we're going to be having an ECOP update during our First Friday. But today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about climate change and the program action team's work. And so I want to move into that and really thank the program committee, John Lawrence, for his leadership, the professional development committee, John Lawrence, for his leadership on that, the entire committee, as well for what they've been doing to help us with our professional development this year. And then in particular for today, Jason Henderson has been working closely with the climate program action team and really leading the efforts related to that program action team. And we have a special guest with us here today, Rosalind McCann, who's working with the National Extension Climate Initiative Steering Committee. Chris Geith has also joined us from Extension Foundation, as Extension Foundation is really key to supporting the efforts of the program action team. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Wendy. We can go to the next slide. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to talk a little bit about the Climate Priority Action Team. Really, one of the things is that people have talked to me about the start that we've gotten into this area. There's been a lot of interest, a lot of funding that's been coming through. And I want to start with, though, really to talk about its beginnings, because it really started more in 2018-19 timeframe when with the Extension Foundation's Climate Coalition. And the basic start is the typical of Extension, a napkin, a beer at a conference conversation. That's kind of where this all started. Chuck Ross, we were out in Seattle at the conference. I think it was the NEDA conference out there, or it might have been Portland, one of the two. And we went to the bar after all the sessions and after dinner, and he really started the conversation of talking about how climate is the existential threat to the U.S. and various different things, and Extension is an organization that can have traumatic impact, and that we're already doing a lot of different things. And wanted to know if I was interested in helping him launch something, maybe and working with the Extension Foundation to get something going. And I agreed. And then 6 months later, Chuck retired as director. So it's kind of where it's gone. But that first launch was really great. And it got us going in terms of what do we mean by climate? What is Extension's role? That coalition had other directors involved, from Ken LaValle to Damona Doy out of Oklahoma State. Wendy was on it. Mike Gaffney, the interim when he was at Washington State, and then Nick Price at Florida. We were all talking about what does this mean? And so one of the first starts, and we had others throughout the organization. We had volunteers, nonprofit organizations. Project Drawdown was involved as well. And it really, I think our first start of where we began with after a couple of conversation rounds was, what are we doing already? Because we knew that we were doing a lot in Extension regarding climate. And oftentimes, and in many locations, we never called it climate because of the political ramifications of using words like climate change in certain settings and in certain audiences. But it was really looking at what do we want to do. And on this, one of the first things that we did to do the assessment was let's contract out with some RFP to have fellows to take a look at what was involved and what was happening in the climate space. And so for us, this is where we first, or other people had some interactions with, but my first interaction with NECI. So if you want to go to the next slide. And this is where NECI, the National Extension Climate Initiative, really became involved with the Climate Coalition and started to work through the fellowships. And so I want to turn it over to Dr. Rosalind McCann, who was NECI steering member, heavily involved with those fellowships, just to talk about what that fellowship and that opportunity did to look at the landscape of Extension in regards to climate.
Thanks, Jason, and still an active NECI steering committee member. I'm a state specialist with Utah State University in sustainable communities. And unbeknownst to us, the same time that the Climate Coalition was forming on the grassroots level, we came together, and I say we, it was a small cohort of Extension faculty, and formed the National Extension Climate Initiative, which started in 2019 as well. And there was a consensus among our group of faculty that upper administration could and should be accelerating Extension efforts in light of the climate crisis before us, and that there wasn't enough coordinated and recognized efforts in Extension to match the urgency of the situation. And the other impetus to forming NECI was the recognition that specialists and agents leading in this work were too vulnerable to negative administrative and colleague ramifications, as we've heard from colleagues ongoing in this work. So we formed with the mission to link climate change related education and research across Extension program areas and associations. And so in March 2020, we held our first webinar with just 5 members of NECI at that time. And 2 years later, we've grown to nearly 600 members that represent 83 distinct institutions. And these institutions range from the University of Guam to the White Earth Tribal and Community College, USDA to CDC representatives, and University of Alaska all the way down to University of Florida. So a cross-country representation of nearly 600 of those engaged and interested in climate work and extension. And looking at the member profiles this last week, this membership consists largely of extension educators and specialists as well, professors at all ranks, program directors, program coordinators, and assistants, and master gardeners. So great representation across the extension system. And so how NECI currently functions is that we hold 2 meetings a month, aside from the steering committee meeting, which is just our core group, which has grown to around 10 or 15 people. But those 2 meeting a month are, first we have a professional development meeting, and then we have an unrecorded safe space that's called the member engagement meeting to share issues faculty are coming into face with or creative ideas for moving forward with this type of work. We generally have 30 to 50 people engaged regularly on those webinars. So we submitted an Extension Foundation grant in the early formation of NECI that resulted in the research and publication of a national report called the Extension Climate and Extreme Weather Programming: Successes, Challenges, and Opportunities. And we'll put that in the chat. And so that report, we can go to the next slide as I talk about this. It's just a snapshot of the report here, the executive summary. So our team conducted a national search and call for any extension programs focused on climate and extreme weather. And we found 43 flagship programs that focused on the topic spanning across the country. But then we found an additional 160 programs, and that number's increased now, that either mention climate or extreme weather or directly connect to Project Drawdown. We heard Jason mention that. So Project Drawdown it's an organization presenting globally recognized solutions for drawing down greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so these programs also directly related to Project Drawdown solutions for addressing greenhouse gas sources and sinks. And from that database, we wanted to take a deeper dive. And so we interviewed 16 purposefully selected extension professionals that were leading the way with climate and extreme weather programming. And we asked them about successes that they would recommend for others doing this work, challenges that they've experienced leading in this area, and then opportunities for moving forward. And from that, we developed clear recommendations from the findings that you can see here on the slide. And there's more depth in the report as well that provide quotes from the participants on each of those subject areas. You can go to the next slide. So instead of a report just sitting on a shelf when it was published, what we wanted to do is accelerate this to the next level. And some on the call were actually involved directly in this action forum that we hosted in April. So from the results of this report, we then decided the best way to accelerate our efforts in the immediate term for extension with climate change is to bring this conversation to the national level, to lift up the work happening in this area and see where the priorities are at the federal, the dean level, and then on the grassroots level as well. So we set up the action forum in that format in April 2021. Over 500 participants engaged over the course of the 3 days to elevate and amplify climate action across the Cooperative Extension Service. So day one of the forum was called Setting the Stage, and we hosted representatives from USDA, NIFA, ECOP, and Sea Grant, National Extension. I see Carolyn Henny's with us today, was on that as well, and a speaker. And they shared visions for unified national extension climate action. Then on day two, we heard from deans of extension from around the country and directors of extension, and they shared their insights. This was called Digging Deeper. And I see Dr. Carl Martin's on the call as well. And he was one of those speakers that we had hosted on that second day. And on the final day, we had a grassroots visioning session using Jamboard with extension educators across the country. And we collaboratively identified actions that the National Extension Climate Initiative, but also extension as a whole could and should take to improve and accelerate the impacts of our collective climate extension work. And so all this was coming to a head at the same time that at the grass tops level, the Climate Coalition was moving forward and then had transitioned into the ECOP Climate Priority Action Task Force. And we published our action items from day 3 of the forum in a document that was shared with extension colleagues across the country, federal employees, and ECOP members. And this is serving as our guiding direction moving forward with NECI. And we are now partnering directly with the ECOP Climate Priority Action Task Force, although we're separate entities still, grassroots and grass tops, to accelerate this work nationally. So our first joint effort was in assisting in the drafting of a national vision and objectives for climate change work and extension, which is now posted on the ECOP Advocacy Toolkit page. And most importantly, I just want to highlight, it says, we have a responsibility to change our nation's path forward by leading with programming and partnerships that directly address climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. The impetus behind this was that from the interviews, we found out many people were feeling insecure in talking about climate change within the extension system. And so now they have a national site they can refer to saying, well, this is a thing that National Extension is supporting and believes in. And so that was a big impetus behind working on that statement. So lastly, I'll just end with a few examples of ripple effects before we move on. So first of all, we were requested to provide a NECI response to the executive order on the climate crisis at home and abroad. And this was a collaboration of 15 extension specialists and department heads representing NECI to provide that response. In my own university, Utah State, the Watershed Science Department formed a climate resiliency extension specialist position, and the department head is a NECI member and said that they formed this directly from interacting with NECI and seeing the need for that position. And USDA NIFA released the Climate Hub grant opportunity, and many submissions were NECI teams as well. So we're seeing some of these effects ripple out into bigger areas. So our next steps with NECI is that we're going to be working on a strategic plan for moving forward, drawing on those action items and really looking at guiding funding and collaborative teams to respond to RFAs, more professional development that's targeted to specific needs for faculty on the ground, and then member support as well, just general member support. So with that, I'll pass it on. Thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, Roz. So go ahead to the next slide. So we've talked a little bit about that. In 2021, when the 7 priorities were identified by ECOP for extension, this really motivated us to start a conversation and ultimately then transition from a climate coalition to the Climate Priority Action Team underneath the program committee on ECOP. There was the main motivation. There was no need to have 2 organizations that were doing the same thing or trying to do the same thing of building national partnerships and collaborations in this space. So when we looked at it of how do we transition, went to a form underneath the program committee. We looked at some of the similar structures that we had in the program committee. So NECI, the National Extension Climate Initiative, took on a similar role to NEWL and served as a liaison organization, the grassroots that we tapped into, similar to NEWL. And the other thing that going forward is that it's the understanding that the Extension Foundation support is highly critical to this effort going forward. Using it in terms of different activities to support the logistics of is one. The other part of it is just helping build connections to various different agencies and organizations through the catalysts. The catalysts have been huge in that part of it as well. And the other aspect of it, of one of the challenges, and we'll talk a little bit about later, is as a director, we're really providing volunteer leadership to these initiatives. And that's a real struggle that we're going to have, and I think is a concern that we need to think about going forward for all the priority action items. And the support that we get from the foundation, you have more day-to-day support where somebody's thinking about it more frequently than just usually the volunteer support that we're able to give as a director we're going through here. So the next slide. Some of the one of the things that's been happening in climate is that when it first formed, I was looking toward like the Health Coalition and how that was had been developed and how that was organized. And one of the things that happened in climate, the opportunity, but also the challenge is we were getting early opportunities emerging because all the funding that was coming for climate. And so I've really described it that how we've been operating has really been ready, fire, aim. It's that things have been happening, and so the amount of time for us to organize has been a little limited, but we've had some early opportunities where we've had to organize on the fly and just take some initiatives and actions on that. And so 2 of them that have been happened in here really relied on Extension Foundation support to help build this team and bringing it together, various different aspects of it, identifying subcomponents, implementation teams formed with it, really emerged from the Climate Hub and with NOAA funding opportunities. Climate Hub was delivered. NOAA, we're still kind of waiting on decisions. And so I want to turn it over to Chris Guy with the Extension Foundation to talk about how those emerged and how the response was brought about.
Okay, thank you, Jason. And I want to thank Jason and Roz and ECOP in general, because it's on behalf of Extension Foundation and our board, we're really pleased to be the partner of this work nationwide with the grass tops and the grassroots and everything in between. So Sandy, if you can go to the next slide, I'd like to share kind of how this has been working, right? What are we doing? How do we work as a foundation supporting the Climate Program Action Team and all of its partners? So one example is the NOAA proposal, which was $49 million over 5 years. As Jason said, it's still being under consideration. We're the prime fiduciary PI, but the leadership is all extension and research people and Sea Grant as a partner. Now, how did this get created? It was a rush, right? But there were at least 25 members on a project team that met on a regular basis. There were like standing meetings, a lot of good input. We noticed that we did not have good 1994 representation, just kind of bubbling up. So we made sure before it was all buttoned up that we made a concerted effort to, it's all included, 1994s and 1890s. But we have special initiatives to make sure that they're engaged in the process and in the deployment. And you can see the list of partners here. Sea Grant was big for this particular one, but you can see universities and some of the other extension organizations. So this is just to give one little snapshot of how this particular grant emerged. We can go to the next slide. And this sort of open process where we get a lot of input, but limited time to respond to something, it's a balancing act, as you can imagine. But the goal through all of this in terms of the foundation's role as a supportive partner walking alongside this effort, not leading the effort, is focusing on new funding for the system, not competing with land-grant universities, but supporting the ECOP initiative, empowering the entire system of approximately 35,000 educators in all 112 institutions. So we keep that global scope. The idea is to spur innovative approaches to identify local solutions to national issues. It's not about, so far anyway, it hasn't been about replicating a single program nationwide. It's really a very different approach. And it's all about local reporting and evaluation, but rolling it up into a national story and demonstrating national impact at a scale that's unlike not just other approaches, but other competitors to the same kinds of funding sources. The Extension Network, as we all know, with research is vast and deep, and there's nothing like it in the US. So if you go to the next slide, I'll share some of the design principles that we've been able to put into effect. The NOAA proposal is an example. There's another proposal going on right now for USDA funding for climate smart commodities with the Climate Pat. And some of these design principles come out of the CDC funding through the health initiative for the Excite project for adult immunization for COVID. So these are starting to be replicated now as we are going on our third round of using them. But these are the design principles, ECOP led, new funding for the system, not competing. Funder outcomes that align with extension priorities, not creating something that doesn't already exist as a priority or making work for already busy people. Enabling participation for all 112 or those who choose to opt in, not a mandate that everyone has to do something. And not promising that all 112 are going to participate either. Extension professionals serving as PIs on the subawards. And right now our record in the ones we've been working on is about 85% or more of the funding is going out through subawards to land-grant universities. Project leadership are extension professionals. It's really important to have an acting director in that leadership role. And success, this is the key one, this last one, success depends. The design of the response to a proposal responds with the diversity of local methods and approaches that are the, bread and butter of extension at the local level. That's the core design approach, is lifting those up, making that the unbeatable value proposition of national approaches like this, national solutions. So anyway, we look forward to continuing to evolve these principles as we work with the other program action teams. We've been very pleased that through our NTAE funding increase that happened last year, that we were able to provide through the NTAE funding over $1 million to the ECOP program action teams. That includes across all of them. So we're happy to be a partner, and it's been an amazing year. Thanks to Jason's leadership and Roz and others on the ECOP program committee. So that's it for my piece, and back to you, Jason.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll go to the next slide. So where that is kind of talking about what we did with the NOAA. It's setting us up, or we're learning a lot in terms of these design principles and how we think about moving forward for other opportunities that come about. So this is for me talking about moving forward. And so the advertisement for this session was talking about the $1 billion partnership for climate smart commodities opportunity from USDA. And so if you could go to the next slide. What are we doing? So right now, in the last couple of weeks, we had an all call out to all those that had signed up to be part of the climate priority action team. And our role was, where we focused on, was matchmaking for 1 billion in there of what is the role of extension in this partnership? How could we bring faculty and specialists together that had an interest in thinking about climate smart commodities and bringing practical applications to producers in that aspect of it there. So right now it appears to be emerging. One group is emerging around dairy that's coming up, and some partnerships in that aspect of it, which is exciting. And then other groups are kind of still percolating. The dairy group is going a little bit forward a little bit faster because they already have partnerships within the supply chain, and how does that work in that aspect of it there. The other part of it is we're thinking about what is Extension's role in building a platform to engage with practical applications. I'm just looking at it from a Purdue perspective. I know other states are doing this. I know Wendy's in California has been doing this. The role of a technical assistance provider in a system. Our roles in these aspects of it, that we might not be leading as the PI on a grant, but how can we partner with others where our extension educators or county agents or already do on-farm type of consultations and all of that, are really doing some type of technical assistance and working with those roles. How does this integrate with the farms that our counterparts in the experiment stations have all across the US? Are there ways that we can work together to think about this of not only just providing the education, but also with our engagements with individual producers on the farm to help them with some of their technical assistance? The next slide, please. The other big thing for 2022 is we really need to organize the climate PAT. Ready, fire, aim is not a long-term organizational solution. So we have to go through and figure out what does it look like, whether it's the larger action team, where we have, usually when the all calls out, we've been getting 60 to 70 people at certain points in times. We've broken it down into 3 implementation teams: climate resilient communities, climate smart agriculture, and ecosystem services. Each of those 3 implementation groups, oftentimes when we have those calls, they get 20 people in each of those subgroups to have conversations to identify aspects of it. And then moving it down into a grant writing component when various different opportunities emerge. You have to winnow down to a core group of people that are going to write the grant and look for assistance from grant writing services if we can find funding, which we have been through the Extension Foundation. I also think that we also, from a leadership perspective, need to think about a steering committee of directors working together, along with grassroots leadership within faculty and organizations like NECI, or NC3 is another group, or Eden as an opportunity in there. But also have this with our USDA partners, other federal agency partners that are with us, and potential funders from nonprofits and other groups. And so for us, it'll be building that steering committee going out. And so I'm starting to reach out to people to serve on that steering committee or join us in that work. And I'm glad that Ashley Stokes has said yes to help out of Tennessee, has said yes to be a part of that, and start a little skunk works of thoughts on that. So really excited about that opportunity. The other part, which I mentioned a little bit, next slide, is I think the next conversation on climate is what about our other counterparts in COPs. I was at an ICOP meeting where they were talking about climate with USDA about a month or so ago in Kansas City, where they're thinking about, from an international perspective, how does climate influence ICOP? I know that the experiment stations are having questions and conversations about climate. What does that mean? There's conversations at APLU. But when I think about it in terms of extension, how do we, for me, and maybe it's coming from a Purdue perspective, and I know what other people are doing, how does extension partner with our experiment stations more closely? Do we consider our farms test beds? You know, At Purdue, we've had an initiative in digital agriculture, and we have turned one of our farms into a digital ag test bed. All of the latest and greatest connections and technology that you could think of is wired up on that farm. The challenge we have is that once we take that new technology that's been developed on that farm off the farm, there's no other farm that has that level of access, and sometimes it doesn't work because we don't have broadband or other things like that. So how do we think about, in terms of working with experiment stations on our farms, that there's a test bed for new technology? And then how do we think about it that it's in a lab situation? But sometimes what works in what we think will work in theory doesn't work when you put it in real world applications on a real world working farm. And that's where Extension can maybe think about being technical assistance providers, on-farm demonstrations, other types of things that happen out there to help with that conversion from theory to actual practice of what we can do. And finally, I just want to close with my two, when people have asked, like, we've started climate action teams, what do you define as success? And obviously, on the next slide, obviously it's about funding, right? We want new levels of funding. From my perspective, we've focused so much on capacity funding that we've ignored all of the money on research where we can come together as a system and be competitive nationally in large parts of research dollars, applied research dollars. How do we do that? I think our success, I'm going to measure it short-term and long-term. Short-term, hopefully we've built a network that convenes when opportunities emerge. We don't know when opportunities are going to come about our way, but we have to be prepared and have a network of people that are ready to come together at a moment's notice, because it seems like over this past year, when funding opportunities emerge, we only have a month to pull groups together, get partnerships built, and write a grant. And that's really hard. And if you're not mobilized ahead of time, it's really difficult to do. And so for me, the short-term success is having a network of people in the climate space that are willing to come together when these opportunities emerge. Some of them are grants. Some of them are USDA wants some insights or thoughts about what a climate core concept would look like, which happened in November, December. And we pulled people together and write a concept note and a draft version of what are some thoughts of what it would be for climate core that we send to USDA to help shape their opinions. I think long-term success is going to be defined by increased funding, but more importantly, I think it's going to be defined by partnerships with federal agencies and nonprofits that when they're thinking about an RFP or thinking about climate and they're trying to formulate their RFP process, that they reach out to Extension to get our perspectives so that we can help shape an RFP process going forward. And I know I think that's how we can be most successful. And I know at Purdue, when we were talking with our department heads and how do we get more involved and know what's coming out in certain aspects of it, and they all talk about we got to know that the RFP is coming out before you know the RFP is coming out. And that's getting connections, being an advisor in certain different ways and understanding what's going on. So with that, I'm going to stop. This is kind of how I define success. There's some other challenges that we have. For example, volunteer leadership from a director is going to be a challenge going forward. I think because of just the amount of time that we have on this. I think the Health Coalition is an example of that as well, of what you can do in that space. And I think the other thing when we come to how many of these initiatives can we support in Extension? And ultimately, how many of these initiatives, when you don't define success, how do you end them when you don't reach your marks? So with that, I'm going to stop, open up to questions and comments, and I always take rebuttals too. So thanks.
Thanks, Jason. This is John Lawrence. If anybody has questions, please unmute your mic and go ahead and ask them or put them in the chat box. I'll try to monitor that and feed them into Jason as we go along here. One question I guess I would start with, Jason, you said, and maybe I'm late to the game here, but if groups are already meeting and someone on this call has not been a part of that, how do you get connected with some of these groups?
Yeah, so the easiest way to get connected is you can email me and on that, or you can email Megan Hirschman, because what I do is I email Megan. Megan's the one in charge of the contact database. So she adds names going through. The other thing that we've learned in terms of getting people connected is that some of the all call outs that we've had through Monday Minute and other different just blanket calls have not really triggered a lot of input coming in or people coming in, some in there. And it has not really triggered a lot of members from the 1890 institutions and the 1994s. And so one of the things that we have to do through this year is become more targeted in the ask. And so we've asked members that are already part of the action team to identify other members and invite them to come in. Bring your friend and your friend's friends and your as well to join this and figure out where things go and on that development type of stage. We need to do more on that front. We'll be doing more over the next year.
Other questions from folks? Rosalind, anything more you'd like to add from NECI's perspective? How is there opportunities to join that group for people that are not already involved?
Definitely. I can put a link to the homepage of the website in the chat, and there's a button there to join the NECI membership, and it's an easy process and gives us some basic demographic data who's joining. We've got a climate afternoon planned at the National Sustainability Summit and National Extension Energy Summit that is to take place at Penn State University in May 15th to 18th, I believe are the dates. And so that whole afternoon, we'll be hosting a collaborative planning session and then continuing the conversation at an evening reception that Tuesday evening at the summit. So if you're interested, I'll put in the link for that summit as well into the chat. And in the immediate term, like I mentioned in the presentation, we are going to be looking at better defining our next immediate steps moving forward with NECI, knowing now what's happening at the national level, which we weren't aware of too much happening when we first started NECI. And now things have accelerated on so many different scales. Where can we best plug in to fill the niches that aren't being addressed at the higher up level?
Oh, John, it looks like there's a question in the chat from Carl Martin.
Yeah, Carl, you want to just go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, I really appreciate the presentation and really appreciate Rosalind's description. And I think Jason really outlined how do we become more engaged or competitive. And when I look at the climate world, at the end of the day, it's really what can we do on the ground? What changes can we make? And I think our network provides us really that unique opportunity. You know, if we talk about the climate centers with USGS, they want to do things on the ground, but they don't have a network. And I think there's one opportunity. I've talked to the director there for the Midwest, and I think they're really excited because they have a lot of the research, you know, the foundational research, but they don't have the network to actually implement change on the ground, along with, I would say, that applied research, because as was pointed out, what sounds good on paper may not actually work on the ground, but we can serve a really critical role, I think, with our network in evaluating what does work, what doesn't work. I also think, just going back to the network, you know, this is still a controversial issue, but I think one of the things we bring is that we're more trusted than any other regulatory agency for sure, at least in our state. I'm guessing that's true in most states. So how do we leverage that trust into, you know, making a difference? No, we're not here to tell you how to manage your water on your land. We're here to work with you side by side to address these issues that are climate related, that are probably impacting, you know, either the ecosystem or the bottom line for particularly our agricultural constituency out there. So I just think there's a great opportunity here, and I really appreciate the work that Jason's been doing leading this, and looking forward to future work in this area. I also think it's an area that won't be going away anytime soon. I think this is one of those areas when we look at investments in base positions, sometimes you got to be careful, like, oh, I don't want to invest. You know, we invested in zoning 25 years ago. 10 years ago, there was no zoning issues to work on here, but yet we had faculty investments. I don't think that's going to be the case when it comes to climate work. I think it's only going to be a growing proposition over time. So just want to say that.
Thanks, Carl. And I see Chris put in the chat box an example of investing early there with the Excite program, the Extension Network through Excite. You got $10 million from CDC to help on vaccination education. But I remember, and haven't been involved at this level for very long, but I remember discussions about extension health programming and network going back a decade or more. But it got us in position, so we were the new kid on the block, the one that was ready to engage when CDC needed help educating. So a part of it is building those partnerships so that when the opportunity presents itself, we're ready. Jason, you had a follow-up comment?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, you know, being a state director and thinking about in this climate space, thinking about what goes at a national level to the climate action team, right? And what collaborations am I building within the state of doing those different aspects of it? And so at the national level, it's really multi-state big projects of doing different aspects of it. And as we were matchmaking, there were some projects that emerged that weren't national in scope and doing different things. Within Indiana, I'm also matchmaking as well with faculty and other smaller groups within Indiana, trying to get them going on. And that point of like, what's our role? I don't know if I'm the only one that's finding this, but the faculty, because of this $1 billion on that, they don't look at Purdue or the university as a good mechanism for some of this funding, because the funding goes to a lot of the funding will have to go to incentivize farmers, and Purdue is not usually the most efficient in its business office of getting money out to different groups. So I'll put it that way. And so we're looking at, you know, partnering with some other entity or organization within the state of Indiana, whether it's like the DNR or the Nature Conservancy or Soil and Water Conservation, the statewide group on that for smaller projects within Indiana. But once you have them as a lead PI or faculty, are like, yeah, we're not really that interested, whatever's going on. But for my extension educators and having funding that generates, I'll call it salary savings to buy out some of their time, because they need that role that Carl talked about of having be that trusted advisor at the local level, having the connections with farmers and connections with other entities at the local level to deliver. I think that's huge. And so that's kind of what we're building in Indiana. My question out to the rest of the group is, can we do that nationally? I don't know, but could we do that as a national system at some point in time? And what would it take?
What about your State Department of Agriculture in terms of rolling money out to farmers? We've had so much experience here with hurricanes and other things, and whenever there's money appropriated, the farmers apply for. Our State Department of Agriculture is very efficient rolling those dollars out to farmers. We're not using our business office within our college or our university, which would take forever to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Do we need to think, so Rich, you know, when people don't ask me questions when I'm in a classroom, I usually ask the students the question. So I'm going to ask questions, I'm flipping now. So do we need to think about NASDA and the relationship that we have nationally in extension and NASDA on some of this to build out a national type of structure? If this is something, I'm just.
Certainly, I think that would be a partner, Jason. And yeah. Rich, to your point, oftentimes we're called upon by whether it be state departments of agriculture or USDA, but in our lane, right? They have a new program rolled out at Farmers Need Education about the program, what it does, what it doesn't do, how to access the dollars. And that's a role we often play, not handing out the dollars, but educating farmers how to access the dollars and getting the word out.
Exactly. And sometimes also helping calculations so that the correct number goes back to the Department of Agriculture and then they cut the check.
Yeah. Rosalind.
I just wanted to provide a brief comment back to what Dr. Martin had asked about trust. And I definitely agree with that. And what we found in our report are some major needs for extension faculty. One is how to access trusted data that's locally relevant in communicating about climate change. And regarding the communications piece, a major section of the report revolves around, as far as strategies for success for those leading this programming, is they figured out ways to frame the issue that connects with the target audience. And so a couple quote examples I've had great success with, instead of saying climate change, saying a changing climate is such a small thing, but I think that has been well received. Another said, you know, it used to be climate change and even climate resiliency and then climate variability. When people see that, it seems like it turns them off. So you just have to find ways to get around the terminology. Extreme weather seems to work very well. And so just these strategies for success on how to frame with various audiences that might keep that relationship of trust and keep the same message moving forward, but maybe a slight shift in terminology will result in much more acceptability. And there's a big professional development need for those of us on the ground with how to do that. So some message framing training would be fantastic.
Excellent point. Words matter in this day and age. Jason, maybe to change the discussion a little bit, you and I had talked about, well, this was before USDA talked about the climate smart agriculture, but one role was locally, what role might our communities people, or we have with communities, thinking about long range planning around climate impact or climate resiliency? I've often said one thing that Iowa State does well, or Extension does well, is we can call a meeting and usually people will show up. And so how do we get people to show up to think about what are the implications for more extreme weather events? I was in a discussion with someone the other day. It says, we've done a great job planning for history. How do we go about planning for the future?
Right. Yeah, John, I think that's great. And that was the basis of our NOAA proposal, is providing additional funding to support the strategic planning of communities to be climate resilient, and leveraging, like what you said, we can pull people together. And the benefit of it is that, we have faculty, specialists, educators that know the process of bringing people together to have these conversations and move it forward. But the benefit of extension is that in my mind, is that we have some consistency because we've all been trained in similar ways of doing certain things. But yet we allow local flexibility, because the response in West Lafayette, Indiana to climate, to make a climate resilient community, is going to be so different than what it is in Miami, Florida, or in the mountains of Colorado. It's going to be so different. And so the benefit of extension is that we can reach all these different places. We can have some consistency in how to operate with us, move funding to different communities and bringing people together, but yet still allow that local flexibility that really matches local needs. And I think that's the beauty of our system. It's also the challenge of our system, because sometimes we got to figure out how to get on the same page, and we all have different needs, but I think that's kind of, which is a real benefit.
I think Chris has a good point that we can have a national response from Extension that doesn't require a single, only one size fits all national program. But are there skills that our educators or specialists need, whether it's around terminology or planning, or just better understanding what resources are available as federal government or others put more resources out there for individuals or communities? Other questions or comments? Friday afternoons approaching springtime. I see people are have their minds elsewhere. So Wendy, I don't know if you have other comments to wrap things up or promo for the next first Friday.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. And thanks so much, Jason, for all of your effort working with John to put this together. Thanks, Rosalind, for joining us today, and Chris as well for Extension Foundation's support of this effort. There is just a quick survey. If you could take a few seconds and complete the survey so that we can get a better sense how we can make this meeting time more useful to you as directors. Other than that, I would say get ready for a fun weekend, and we'll see you back here next month. But please do fill out that survey before you go. Thanks, everyone.